The 15th of August 1943, Kiska Island, Alaska. In the gray water of the North Pacific, landing craft moved toward a shoreline that looked less like a battlefield than the edge of the world. The men inside them were American and Canadian soldiers, soaked by spray, stiff from cold, carrying rifles, ammunition, radios, flamethrowers, mortars, medical kits, and the memory of what had just happened on Attu. They had been told to expect a Japanese garrison dug into caves, ridgelines, tunnels, machine gun nests, and fog. They had been told that every rise of tundra could hide a sniper, every crater could conceal a booby trap, every silence could be a deliberate lure. Offshore, the invasion fleet waited. Aircraft circled above the clouds. Naval guns had already pounded the island. Intelligence estimates had warned of thousands of Japanese troops. The men who stepped off those landing craft believed they were entering one of the final battles on American soil in World War II. And yet, as boots hit the black volcanic beach, the most dangerous thing on Kiska was not an enemy machine gun, it was expectation. The soldiers advanced into mist so thick it swallowed units whole. They saw movement where there was only fog. They heard echoes and thought they were rifles. They found abandoned huts, empty gun positions, cold cook fires, and tunnels that seemed built for ambush. Somewhere in that confusion, men began firing. Not at Japanese troops, but at shadows, at noises, at one another. By the time Kiska was declared secure, Allied soldiers had been killed and wounded in an operation where the enemy had already escaped. No Japanese defender was there to meet them. The question at the heart of this story is not simply how the Japanese vanished. It is how a major Allied assault could move forward against an island that the enemy had already abandoned. This is not a story about cowardice or stupidity. It is a story about fog, fear, memory, intelligence, pride, and the danger of believing that the enemy must behave exactly as you expect him to. To understand Kiska, we have to go back to a moment when the war reached the American North. On June 3 and 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft struck Dutch Harbor in Alaska, bringing war to a place most Americans had never imagined as a front line. At almost the same time that the Imperial Japanese Navy was moving toward Midway, Japanese forces also moved into the western Aleutians. Kiska was occupied on June 6, and Attu followed a day later. These islands were not tropical stepping stones like Guadalcanal or Tarawa. They were volcanic, treeless, battered by wind, wrapped in fog, and separated from the American mainland by distances that made every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, and every aircraft engine part matter. But geography gave the Aleutians symbolic and strategic weight. The islands formed a northern arc between North America and Asia, and for both sides, they represented possibility, a route, a shield, a warning line, or at minimum a place the enemy could not be allowed to hold without consequence. The Japanese occupation was also psychologically powerful. Enemy troops were now on territory belonging to the United States. Alaska was still a territory, not yet a state, but to the American public and to military planners, that distinction did not erase the fact that foreign troops were occupying American soil. On Kiska, the Japanese began turning the harbor into a base. They built seaplane facilities, submarine support areas, roads, telephone lines, tunnels, shelters, gun positions, and anti-aircraft defenses. Their men worked in a landscape that punished them as much as it protected them. Heavy equipment was limited. Supplies had to be brought through dangerous waters. Weather made construction brutal. Still, they dug in. From the air, American crews saw evidence of a growing enemy position. From nearby bases, the 11th Air Force began bombing Kiska again and again, trying to disrupt construction and supply. But the weather fought the Americans too. Fog covered targets. Storms scattered formations. Aircraft came back damaged by anti-aircraft fire or by the conditions themselves. In the Aleutians, nature was not background. Nature was an active force on the battlefield. Commanders had to plan not only against the Japanese, But against cold water, bad maps, unreliable visibility, radio failures, and the mental fatigue of men forced to operate in a place where every horizon looked empty and every empty place might be hiding something, Kiska became a fortress of appearances. To the Americans watching from above, it showed enough signs of life to remain dangerous, but not enough to reveal the truth clearly. Japanese gun batteries were placed around the harbor and on high ground. Anti-aircraft guns covered approaches. Coastal defense weapons guarded likely landing areas. Tunnels were cut into the island for storage, shelters, and protection from bombardment. The Japanese understood that Kiska Harbor was the key, and their defenses reflected that. They did not need to dominate the entire island. They needed to make any Allied assault into the central and eastern zones costly. From the American side, every known Japanese position became part of a mental map. Here was the airfield area, here were the caves, here were the suspected gun emplacements, here were the ridges that might repeat the horrors of Attu. The island was bombed heavily, naval units shelled it. Pilots reported damage, smoke, and sometimes what they believed was anti-aircraft fire. But bombing a fog-bound island did not necessarily produce clarity. Craters, smoke, drifting clouds, and exploding debris could be misread from the air. The island's silence could mean the enemy had withdrawn, or it could mean the enemy had learned to hide better. That ambiguity mattered. In a war where Japanese forces had often fought from concealed positions and resisted almost to the last man, silence was not automatically reassuring. It could feel like proof of a trap. The Allied imagination was shaped by experience, and experience had taught hard lessons. At Attu in May 1943, American troops landed expecting resistance near the beaches, but Japanese defenders had pulled back into the mountains and fought from ridges, caves, and fog-covered positions. That battle became a cold nightmare of exposure. Mud, trench foot, confusion, and close combat. The final Japanese attack on Attu left hundreds of bodies on the battlefield and burned into Allied thinking a single lesson. The absence of immediate resistance did not mean the enemy was gone. It might mean the enemy was waiting. So when Kiska looked quiet, many planners did not see evacuation. They saw Attu again. They saw a defender who had chosen the high ground, a garrison that had stopped revealing itself, and an island prepared to turn the Allied advance into another killing ground. That belief did not come from nowhere. It came from evidence filtered through fear, recent memory, and assumptions about how Japanese troops were expected to fight. The Allied plan for Kiska was called Operation Cottage, and it was built with the seriousness of an assault against a heavily defended objective. More than 34,000 troops were assembled, including thousands of Canadians. The 1st Special Service Force, a joint American-Canadian unit trained for difficult missions, would take part in its first combat operation. Major General Charles H. Corlett commanded the landing force, while Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid held responsibility in the North Pacific. The invasion force gathered around Adak and other forward bases, where soldiers loaded ships, checked rifles, waterproofed gear, studied maps, and prepared for a kind of combat that the Aleutians had already made infamous. The Americans had learned from Attu that cold weather equipment mattered. Parkas and Arctic footwear replaced some of the inadequate gear that had caused so much suffering earlier. The plan called for landings on different parts of the island, with Allied units moving inland through fog, tundra, and steep terrain to find and destroy the Japanese garrison. Before the landings, air and naval bombardment intensified. In July, hundreds of tons of bombs and shells were dropped or fired onto Kiska. To soldiers waiting aboard ships, that firepower could sound reassuring. But bombardment also created a terrible psychological rhythm. If the enemy survived all that, then he must be deep underground, and if he was deep underground, then he would appear when the attackers were most vulnerable. Reports from pilots became increasingly strange. Many saw little or no activity. Some still believed they had received fire. Intelligence analysts had to explain the contradiction. Had the Japanese evacuated? Had they dispersed into the hills? Were they conserving ammunition? Had they gone silent deliberately? In modern language, Kiska became a problem of assumption management. The available clues did not point in only one direction. They could support evacuation, but they could also support concealment. Commanders chose the interpretation that seemed safer. The Japanese were probably still there. If that assumption was wrong, the operation would be embarrassing. If the opposite assumption was wrong, and the Japanese were waiting, the cost could be catastrophic. That is the trap Kiska set before a single Allied soldier landed. It forced commanders to choose between the danger of overestimating the enemy and the danger of underestimating him. In war, the second danger often feels less forgivable. If this story is already making you look at World War II differently, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on the notification bell. This channel is built for the forgotten operations, the buried reports, the strange decisions, and the battles that were shaped not only by weapons, but by intelligence, weather, logistics, and human judgment. To understand why Allied commanders expected bloodshed on Kiska, Attu has to be remembered not as a footnote, but as a warning. In May 1943, American forces landed on Attu and found the beaches less defended than expected. That did not mean the island was weak. It meant the Japanese had chosen where they wanted to fight. The battle moved into valleys, ridges, and passes where cold, fog, and terrain broke the clean lines of planning. Units struggled through muskeg that swallowed boots and slowed supply. Naval gunfire and air support were limited by weather. Soldiers fought uphill against positions that appeared and disappeared in mist. Casualties mounted. Men suffered from exposure and trench foot as much as from bullets. American commanders who had expected a short fight found themselves trapped in a slow, costly struggle. At the end of May, with their position collapsing, many surviving Japanese defenders launched a final desperate attack that tore into American rear areas before being stopped. When the battle ended, the casualty figures were shocking, and the memory was worse. Attu taught the Allies that the enemy might abandon beaches, hide inland, endure bombardment, and then strike at close range. It also taught them that the Aleutians could turn even a successful invasion into a test of endurance. When planners looked at Kiska, they saw an island with better harbor facilities, a larger estimated garrison, more developed positions, and a reputation for being the stronger Japanese base. That made caution logical. Kiska was not treated as an empty place because, in the Allied mind, empty places in the Aleutians had already proven deadly. The very lessons learned from Attu helped prepare the Allies for Kiska and helped blind them to the possibility that Kiska would not repeat Attu at all. This is one of the cruelest patterns in military history. Commanders prepare for the last battle because the last battle is the one that bled them. They do not do this because they are foolish. They do it because dead men have taught them something. But the enemy also learns. Japan had watched Attu too. Japanese commanders saw what happened when an isolated garrison was left to be annihilated. They understood that Kiska was cut off, that supply by submarine was dangerous, and that Allied pressure was rising. Behind the Allied curtain of bombardment and planning, the Japanese were making their own calculation. After Attu fell, Kiska was strategically exposed. The island could no longer be held in a meaningful way. Supplies had become increasingly difficult to move through the blockade. The original Japanese plan was to evacuate the garrison gradually by submarine, but that method became too dangerous after losses and damage to submarines assigned to the mission. A slow evacuation also risked weakening the garrison piece by piece, while leaving the remainder trapped if the Allies attacked early. The Japanese then turned to a far bolder option, a rapid surface evacuation under cover of Aleutian fog. On the 28th of July 1943, a Japanese force of cruisers and destroyers slipped through the North Pacific conditions that had frustrated both sides for months. In less than an hour, more than 5,000 Japanese troops were taken off Kiska. It was an extraordinary operation, part seamanship, part timing, part luck. The same fog that had protected Japanese defenses now protected their escape. The Allies did not detect the evacuation in time. For the Japanese, it was a rare success in a deteriorating strategic position. For the Allies, It created an invisible battlefield. After July 28, the island still looked like a military objective. The tunnels remained. The guns remained. The abandoned structures remained. Some signs could be interpreted as suspicious absence, but absence is hard to prove from the air, especially when fog, bomb damage, and previous assumptions fill the gaps. The Japanese had not simply left an island. They had left behind the image of occupation. This is why Kiska is more than an oddity. It reveals that intelligence is not only about gathering information, it is about deciding what absence means. No movement could mean evacuation. No radio traffic could mean withdrawal. Unrepaired bomb damage could mean no one is left to repair it. But in a war shaped by deception, discipline, and concealed defenses, those same clues could be read as an enemy deliberately going quiet. Allied commanders did not lack information. They lacked certainty. And when certainty is absent, fear often supplies the answer. On Kiska, the fog did not merely hide the Japanese evacuation. It preserved the Allied belief that the Japanese must still be there. When Operation Cottage began, the landing itself carried the weight of all those assumptions. American troops came ashore first. Canadian troops followed in another sector. The 1st Special Service Force pushed into the island's interior, expecting contact. The beaches were not swept by machine gun fire, but that did not calm anyone for long. Attu had begun that way too. Men moved inland across rough ground, through cold mist and rain. The island seemed full of traces: empty trenches, abandoned supplies, tunnels, Japanese equipment, silent gun positions, buildings damaged by bombing, and paths that disappeared into fog. Every trace raised the same question. Was it abandoned or watched? Patrols moved carefully, but the weather broke coordination. Units lost visual contact. Radio communication was difficult. Sound traveled strangely. The absence of an enemy became psychologically unstable. Soldiers had trained themselves to expect fire, so they interpreted the environment through that expectation. A shape in the fog could become a soldier. A burst of sound could become a Japanese weapon. A friendly unit could become an enemy patrol. In that atmosphere, tragedy became possible. Allied troops fired on Allied troops. Men were killed and wounded by friendly fire, accidents, mines, booby traps, and the sheer danger of moving thousands of armed men through terrible terrain while expecting ambush. Offshore, the destroyer USS Abner Reed struck a mine on August 18, suffering devastating casualties. That single explosion reminded everyone that an empty island could still kill. The Japanese did not need to be physically present for the battlefield they had built to remain dangerous. Mines, abandoned defenses, bad visibility, and fear could do what riflemen no longer could. By the time the island was searched, the truth became undeniable. The caves were empty. The main camp was empty. The expected defenders were gone. The Allied soldiers had invaded an island that had already been evacuated almost 3 weeks earlier. There were no Japanese casualties because there were no Japanese troops present to fight. This was the strange horror of Kiska. Not a massacre by enemy fire, not a heroic last stand, but a costly collision between preparation and reality. Men had risked and lost their lives in an operation whose central enemy had become an assumption. Yet, it would be too easy and unfair to treat Kiska only as a blunder. The operation ended Japan's occupation of the Aleutians and removed the last Japanese foothold in the Western Hemisphere. It also ended the Aleutian Islands campaign, giving the United States its first theater-wide victory of the war. The Japanese evacuation meant that the Allies avoided what might have been another Attu, a brutal fight through ridges and tunnels against an isolated force. The fact that no enemy stood on the island does not mean the operation was meaningless. It means the final act of the campaign became psychologically different from what planners expected. For the soldiers who landed, the danger was real even if the enemy was absent. Mines were real. Friendly fire was real. Cold, fog, and confusion were real. The bodies were real. Families receiving telegrams did not receive a footnote explaining that the Japanese had already left. They received grief. Kiska also forced a deeper lesson about intelligence. Modern military analysis often uses Kiska as a case study in assumptions and perceptual bias. The danger of allowing a plausible belief to harden into operational reality even when contradictory clues appear. The Allied assumption that the Japanese remained on Kiska was not irrational. It was supported by recent experience, by enemy behavior elsewhere, by the difficulty of proving absence, and by the risk of underestimating a defender. But because it was so plausible, it became hard to dislodge. That is what makes dangerous assumptions so powerful. The foolish assumption is easy to challenge. The reasonable assumption is harder. It wears the face of caution. It feels responsible. It tells commanders that ignoring it would be reckless. At Kiska, the reasonable assumption survived long enough to send an invasion force ashore. Afterward, the island became a battlefield of evidence. Japanese guns, tunnels, abandoned midget submarines, bomb craters, roads, batteries, and rusting equipment. Today, those remains still testify to both sides of the story. Kiska's legacy lives in the uncomfortable space between victory and embarrassment. Strategically, the campaign succeeded. Japan's northern outposts were gone. The threat to Alaska had ended. American and Canadian forces had shown they could project power into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Engineers had built bases where almost nothing existed. Aircrews had flown in weather that could kill without enemy help. Sailors had operated in waters where fog, mines, and storms were constant threats. Infantry had endured cold, isolation, and uncertainty on terrain most armies would prefer to avoid. There is genuine courage in that. But Kiska also warns against the seductive power of a story commanders tell themselves before the facts are complete. The story was simple. The Japanese fought to the death on Attu. Kiska is stronger than Attu. Therefore, Kiska will be another deadly fight. That story shaped planning, expectations, and perception. When evidence appeared that did not fit, reduced activity, silence, unrepaired damage, it did not automatically overturn the story. Instead, it was absorbed into it. Maybe the Japanese were hiding. Maybe they had moved inland. Maybe they were saving fire for the landing. In war, the mind often prefers a dangerous enemy it understands to an empty battlefield it cannot explain. That is why Kiska still matters. It is not just a strange World War II anecdote. It is a warning to every intelligence officer, planner, commander, and citizen who studies war from a distance. Evidence does not speak by itself. Human beings interpret it. And human beings carry memory, fear, pride, doctrine, trauma, and expectation into every interpretation. The men who landed on Kiska were not actors in a comedy of errors. They were soldiers entering a place they had every reason to fear. The tragedy is that by the time they arrived, the Japanese had already made the one move the Allies least expected. They had chosen not to die there. They had vanished into the fog, leaving the Allies to fight the island, the weather, and the assumptions they brought ashore. So when we look back at Kiska, we should resist the easy joke. An army invaded an empty island. The truth is sharper than that. An army invaded an island that was empty of enemy troops, but full of danger, memory, and meaning. The Japanese occupation had been real. The bombing had been real. The base, guns, tunnels, and strategic anxiety had been real. The suffering on Attu had been real. The fear of another last stand had been real. And the casualties on Kiska were real. What vanished was not the war, but the enemy at the center of the Allied plan. That absence revealed how much of warfare happens before the first shot. In estimates, briefings, assumptions, rehearsals, maps, intelligence summaries, and the private imagination of men approaching a shore. Kiska asks a question that reaches far beyond 1943. How do you know when the enemy is gone? Not when you hope he is gone. Not when the signs suggest he may be gone. Not when a report says activity has decreased. But when do you know enough to change the plan, reduce the risk, or challenge the story everyone has accepted? In the Aleutians, that answer came too late. The island was secured, but the lesson remained unsettled. Somewhere between the fog and the abandoned gun pits, Operation Cottage became one of World War II's strangest reminders that wars are fought not only against enemies, but against uncertainty. The battlefield does not care what commanders believe. It only reveals, sometimes brutally, whether they were right. If this story helped you see the war from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications, because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.